Welcome to another episode of Magic TV, where today we're going to discuss all things Phyrexia All-Be-One, the future of digital magic, and just the best ways to say no to your opponent, basically.
Yeah, the top 8 Counterspells does not usually get new additions to the list, but there have been some pretty good contenders recently.
When something slips in, we got to update it. Welcome to another episode of Magic TV. As always, brought to you by the fine folks over at TCGplayer.com. Luis, today we're shouting out the subscription. All right. So the easiest way to get to this is just go to TCGplayer.com, and right in that black little banner up top, there is a subscribe now button. And that is where you want to go for all things previously called Infinite, but that kind of space, but just taking your game to the next level and really investing in yourself as a card game player.
Yeah, you can get awesome articles by such writers as Reed Duke, Pro Tour champion, Seth Manfield, Andrea Mengucci. Just recently added Jessie Robkin. She's gotten some really great articles on Modern Breach, for example. She's truly a master of the deck, and really a lot of cool stuff. Also, you could read stuff by me if you're so inclined to.
Well, it was very difficult not to go, but some great authors, and like even in the email when we were talking about this episode, we got it was like the pre-filled copy was Pro Tour winners as recently as a couple of weeks ago, like Reed Duke, and as recently as 15 years ago, like Louis Scott Vargas. It was pretty savage. But you're right. There's a bunch of amazing content on there, and then there's the sort of like the more functional stuff, right? Free shipping and tracking, extra bonus bucks, all that good stuff. Head over to TCGplayer.com right now and find out all the goodies available. But staying here, we're going to talk about the top 8 counterspells, which, like you teased at the top of the show, has a brand new addition, something you don't see very often.
Yeah, so the top 8 counterspells, we've got a combination of free spells that are very cheap, and spells that give you kind of pretty good benefits when they start. We're going to start with number 8, and this is the new card. We've got Minor Misstep, narrowly edging out Spell Pierce on the list. So Minor Missteps is 1 blue mana instant, counter a spell that costs 1 or less. It's seeing play in Legacy, Vintage, Modern, and you know what? I don't think it's crazy to put it in your standard deck either. It is the best, of course, in a format with a high density of very cheap spells.
Well, everything gets just driven down, right? But anytime you print a card with 1 pip on it and the word counter, it's going to get some kind of, I guess, +1/+1 counters, but generally counter target spell, you're going to get some kind of utility out of it, and this is no exception.
Well, I mean, think about it a little bit like a duress, where, but instead of trading 1 mana for 0 mana, you're trading 1 mana for 1 mana. Obviously, the range is a little limited. You can only counter cheap spells, but still, being able to lay Island Go, counter their turn 1 play, and a lot of blue decks are interested in that.
And like you said, in a lot of those formats where those costs are driven down, you can duress and whiff, but it's going to be rare you don't find a spot to pop off a Minor Misstep.
Next up, we've got one of our free spells on the list, Force of Negation. So it's 1 blue to exile, and it's important that it exiles. It's actually a nice little benefit. Counter and exile a non-creature spell. But if it's your opponent's turn, you can actually cast it for free by pitching a blue card, exiling one of your own blue cards.
Force of style.
Yep, definitely. And this card goes a long way in stopping unfair decks, because fair decks, they have creatures, or maybe they're not doing anything, or taking out a key card will really disrupt them. But Force of Negation, fantastic card. You're getting 2 for 1, right? You're trading 2 of your cards for 1 of theirs, but you're getting a significant mana advantage. They spent 2, 3, 4, 5 mana on their spells, and there's nothing more brutal than casting something like a Teferi, right, in Modern, and getting Force of Negation by a tapped out opponent who used all their mana on their turn.
Well, that's what I was going to say. There's 2 factors there. Like you're right, you said you are giving up a 2 for 1 for it, but there are some, not all cards are created equal, right? And there are some that are very, very pivotal in the flow of a game, and that combined with the whole false sense of security. I mean, nobody falls for this twice, obviously, thinking the opponent's tapped out. And digital magic, which we'll get into a little bit, can rat you out a little bit sometimes with like the way priority and stuff works. But generally speaking, whenever you pitch a card to this, you are more than happy to do it, I would say.
Yeah, and it's kind of like the in-between Force of Will, where, which may or may not be making an appearance on the list. We'll see.
Right.
It will. But it can't counter creatures, so it's got a little bit less utility, but it also only costs 3 to hardcast. And once you get past the first 5 turns of the game, getting hardcasting Force Negation is a pretty common play to make.
Yeah, the decks that have this in there are not prone to tapping out on their own turn anyway. That's not something that they're super interested in most of the time anyway. So definitely a solid inclusion. And like you said, a little bit of a tease for the big brother coming up down the line, I think.
So next up is an interesting one. It's Red Elemental Blast. For 1 red mana, you get to counter any blue spell. That's why it's on the list. It's counterspell, or destroy a blue permanent. It's also got Pyroblast, which is effectively the same thing. The slight minor difference that people are going to talk about is you can cast Pyroblast targeting anything because it just checks if it's blue,
which it doesn't have to be a blue thing to target it. Yeah.
Which sounds weird, but if you have something like a Young Pyromancer or Monastery Mentor in your deck, it lets you play a spell for free.
Right, just putting something in the stack is all you care about. You don't care about the effect at all.
And there's the reverse. There's Hydroblast and Blue Elemental Blast. Historically, the red one has been much better because blue cards are better than red cards. So countering a blue card is better. But they both see play. And the reason I included this on the list was for 1 mana, you can counter any blue card or destroy any blue permanent. Incredibly powerful sideboard card. We won't see this reprinted anytime soon in in legality of standard or modern, anything like that. And it's still a very good card in vintage and legacy. Just paying 1 mana as a counterspell is great. And the fact that it can also just snipe a Dak Fade in play, a Hull Breacher in play, whatever it is you want, really big deal. So Red Elemental Blast, of course, you got to pick the alpha card to make the list, though Pyroblast is actually slightly better.
But there's no, I mean, something we can't discount or not or underemphasize here is that this is a non-blue card, which is not, it gets a big bump from getting access to an effect that other colors, generally speaking, don't. I'm surprised, spoiler, that I wouldn't have been shocked if you put Mana Tithe on the list for the same reason, right? Red has strengths, white has strengths, and countering things is not one of them. So when you do get to do that, it is more potent and more unexpected and way more tilting as a result, especially Mana Tithe, I think.
Definitely. Moving on, we go from 1 mana to 0 mana. We've got Daze. So it's 1 and a blue. It's a 4 spike. 1 and a blue, counter a spell unless they pay 1. But it's got the alternate cost. You can return an island to your hand to cast Daze. And this one shows up in vintage every now and then. But thanks to the fast artifact mana like Mox is not the most popular. But Legacy is where Daze shine. I've even heard people talk about, should Daze be banned? We should not. But it also shouldn't be printed and put into modern or standard. This card is really obnoxious if you're not expecting it. And sometimes even if you are, the Delver decks get to basically punish anyone who's trying to spend 3 or more mana on.
How dare they? The hubris, right?
But even just on the play, the classic Turtle and Volcanic Island Delver, Daze your 1-drop, you traded your turn for their turn. You had to return a land, but you're playing such a low curve deck that's not a huge cost. Plus, there's a little combos like Mystic Sanctuary, right? You fetch that out, you put an Expressive Iteration back on top, and then you Daze one of their spells, returning Mystic Sanctuary since it is an island, getting you another bite at that apple. And Daze, I think, pretty much single-handedly makes a lot of decks shy away from playing cards like Liliana of the Veil or Jace the Mind Sculptor. Anything that costs 3 or more mana, really vulnerable in a world full of Dazes, which Legacy typically has been.
And it's one of those cards where if you're a newer player, if you haven't encountered it before, reading it, you're like, it's one of those things where like the classic adage is that new players hate paying life for things. Because they're like, why do I want to pay life? Even like a Sign in Blood, why do I want to pay life to draw 2 cards? And you look at this, you're like, oh, this is all clunky and weird. I'm never doing this. It is so potent. And I mean, it's a common theme that the costs are all over the place on this top 8 list, that you can tap out and not just pay nothing, but actually tap out. And like you said, you're not even 2-for-1ing yourself here. You're kind of just sort of tempoing yourself out a little bit. And that's a cost you're more than happy to pay.
Well, on the flip side, we're moving into the realm of the expensive counters on the list because full half the counters on this list are free. Counterspell, the classic. It's literally the name of the kind of the whole.
Right, topic. You got to play the hits sometimes, right? There's nothing wrong with that.
Counterspell is just a fantastic card. Blue, counter target spell. Very simple. Showed up in alpha. Really good effect. Was in extended, was in standard. You got to play with it. For a long time, it wasn't legal in modern forward, but then thanks to Modern Horizons, I think, or is it Modern Horizons 2? I don't remember which one.
It's in Eternal Masters. I can't see it here on the list, but it's one of the 2 of them.
In any case, Counterspell's back, at least in modern. Still would be a bit much for standard. Because just 2 mana to counter any spell unconditionally. It's not negate. It's not essence scatter. Yeah, exactly. It's not mana leak. Doesn't make them pay mana. Granted, it costs 2 blue mana. A lot of these counters that I just mentioned cost 1 and a blue. But Counterspell, really strong card. I remember playing with this, 20 years ago and playing with it now. And it's a linchpin of like the Murktide Regent decks, for example, in modern. And doesn't really get a whole lot better than Counterspell. I mean, there's only a couple counters I think are better, and it does you are allowed to play it in more recent formats than just the oldest of the old.
And it is so nice. I mean, from just like a design perspective, any card that has 3 words in its effect, I'm here for 100%. And like I was gonna say, you can imagine this being one of the first cards they put in the game, but we actually know for a fact it was. It's such a like obvious now to us designed to be like, all right, blue, counter a thing. Perfect. That makes exactly perfect sense. And you're right. It's the reason this list is called Counterspells is because of this card. So, I mean, it would be pretty wild not to include it somewhere just for being the first, if nothing else.
And you can actually see the evolution, right? Counterspell for a long time, this is what it cost. Blue, counter target spell. Then cancel showed up. That's blue, one counter target spell. And for a while, cancels were like the kind of thing. And then they started getting slightly more advantages.
You get like dissipate and all that kind of stuff.
Dissipate, dissolve, all sorts of advantages. But the current cost to counter any spell unconditionally is 3. Counterspell costs 2, and there's a reason it shows up in a lot of older formats.
It feels like it should be 2.5, right? Because like you mentioned, 2 is probably a little too good, and 3, they're always tacking some nonsense like surveil or whatever onto it. And you're like, okay, I wish you could just be 2.5 because that's clearly where the balance kind of wants it to be. But alas, we got to be stuck with probably one of the most reprinted cards ever, to be honest. The list of the number of these you can get is huge. Brief sidebar: is there a favorite counterspell art for you?
When I play in tournaments, I either play with beta counterspells because I just really like the way the old cards look, or the arena ones where you got the guy with a cloak dodging on the wall.
Oh yeah, where he's like,
arena,
that's a good one.
The 1996 arena promos that I like those ones too.
I'm partial to classic wiggly fingers myself. I think it's hard to go wrong with that.
Yeah. Well, Counterspell is good, but what about a strictly better Counterspell? So this is Mana Drain with the.
This card is ridiculous. Enemies. The first time I read this, I was like, "What are you talking about?"
Well, so Mana Drain is blue, counter target spell. At the beginning of your next main phase, add X colorless mana to your mana pool, where X is the cost of that spell. So, look, you can see what the designers. This is from Legends. This is again the first like 2 years of the game. Yeah. You can see what the designers were thinking. They're like, well. Counterspell is really good, but at a high rarity, we could do a counter where you steal the mana, you drain the mana, and plus it's balanced because back then mana burn existed. If you didn't spend the mana, you would take damage. And I remember people losing. Myself have lost to mana drain, mana burn damage. Of course, mana burn doesn't exist anymore, and as it turns out, mana drain was still busted.
Yeah, you were fine with it every time. You're right. Mana drain or mana burn being a problem. Also, using rarity as a balance tool isn't really something that's a consideration anymore because of things like TCGplayer and just flooding the market. But like you're right. Back then, you'd be like, maybe you hear tell of a kid at a different school who has a mana drain, and that's their way of keeping the power level down.
But I mean, just imagine the gameplay of your opponent goes island, you play your turn 2 play, they mana drain it, and they play a 5 mana play on their turn, and it just gets worse from there. I mean, especially in the old days when you just mana drain a Sheevan Dragon and fireball your opponent or something. But mana drain, so it's high on the list because of how powerful it is. And I think given the kind of context of this list, I do think it makes sense to include it. It's a cube staple. It's a really good, early pick in cube. The thing is, Mana Drain doesn't really see play anymore. It's actually funny because partially it's its own fault. It's too powerful. It's banned in Legacy, right? You would not be able to play it in Legacy, and it would be, I think, absurdly busted in Legacy. They shouldn't unban it. But in Vintage, the most powerful of the powerful, it turns out 2 mana to counter a spell is just kind of pushing it. And
also the vast majority of the time you're getting 1 or 2 mana out of it on the kickback.
So you're seeing a lot more, Force of Will, Spell Pierce, Red Elemental Blast, Flusterstorm type cards. You just can't really afford to play Mana Drain. But that said, I think on the merits, it's still easily 3rd place on the list.
Well, the only other format it's legal in is Commander, and counterspells in Commander are pretty rough anyway.
It depends. It's not the most advantageous play, spending one of your cards to counter and make an enemy of someone else. So, but I just mentioned it, so let's move on to it. Force of Will. This card, 3 blue counter target spell, but as an alternate cost. And this was the first alternate cost in Alliances. There's a cycle of them. You can pay 1 life and exile a blue card in your hand to cast Force of Will. So this was a groundbreaking card because now your opponent could counter your spells even though they had no mana, even on turn 0. And I remember it used to be like, well, you got to get something in under the counter, shield before they have two islands untapped for their counter spell or a mana drain. Now Force of Will just let you do that. As a side note, how many of the rest of the cycle do you know?
I think, oh God, none of them. Hang on. Actually, off the top of my head, none of them.
All right. Well, it's Bounty of the Hunt's the green one. It distributes 3+1/+1 counters. Scars of the Veteran is the white one. It prevents up to 7 damage and gives a +0/+1 counter for every damage prevented.
This is Lightning Bolt and everything all over, and Ancestral Recall all over again.
Kind of. The red and black ones actually see play. Pyrokinesis. You can
I do know
red
Pyrokinesis.
card. It deals 4 damage divided as you choose. That card saw some like Legacy Goblins play, that sort of thing. And then Contagion sees some play every now and then. It's you can pay 1 life, exile a black card, and it distributes 2 -2/-1 counters.
My favorite thing, I used to have a commander deck that was all just the whole purpose of the deck was a dumb gimmick, and it was to make things as difficult as possible to track. So I think I had a Contagion, I had like a Frankenstein's Monster, so, you know, +2/+0 counters, +0/+2 counters. It was brutal. I loved it. So that speaks to me. But you're right. I don't think the podium of those 5 cards is not an evenly stepped one, right? No, Force of
Will, right there. Then a little bit of Contagion, a little bit of Pyrokinesis, and then people would have to be reminded what the other 2 did. But Force of Will is just a staple 4 of in Legacy and Vintage. There has been some discussion, could Modern have Force of Will? I think it wouldn't be a good thing for Modern, but it would be kind of funny to see what the
it'd be a fun 3 weeks, you mean? Like
right.
That's the
But no, Force of Will, I mean, you are getting 2 for 1, but again, you're even paying a life, but you're spending 0 mana, and they spent mana on their card, and just that power level is hard to give up. But what I really like about this list is that it's bookended. In 8th place, we had Minor Misstep, right? And this was, 1 mana counterspell that costs 1 or less. Well, what if I told you there was a version of that costs 0 mana? And of course, we're talking about Mental Misstep. It costs 1 Phyrexian blue mana. So you can pay a blue mana or 2 life to cast it. Counter target spell that costs 1. I actually played a Legacy Grand Prix where this card was legal. And we played 4 copies of it in our like blue, black, green control deck, Bug Still, that Paulo made top 8 of the tournament with. And it was just so dumb because this card's not restricted to blue decks. You could just put it in any deck. And people would just be kind of priced into. There was basically 2 things you could do in that field. You could play no cards that cost 1, which is a pretty huge drawback. 1 is the best.
That's a wild deck building restriction. Yeah.
No Swords to Plowshares, no Lightning Bolt, no Thoughtseize, no Ether Vial, no Ponder, no Brainstorm, none of those cards. And some decks did that. These are the decks now that would play Chalice of the Void, right? You see some people playing no 1-drops. Sure, you can dodge Mental Misstep. Or you just played your 1-drops and you played 4 of your own Mental Missteps no matter what deck you were playing, because you had to counter their Mental Missteps or counter their 1-drops. And as a result, this card got rightfully banned in Legacy quite quickly. Banned in Modern, also a great call. Restricted in Vintage, which I think is wonderful, because Mental Misstep, it always feels so brutal when you draw the misstep and they don't, and you just misstep their turn 1.
Well, it just creates a good moment, right?
You just like misstep your Ragavan. It's just, ugh. But actually, the only place I liked Mental Misstep was in Standard. Back in Standard, you could play like 2 copies in your Delver deck because not every deck had tons of 1-drops. It was good when it came up, but it was dead plenty of the time, and you had to like pay those costs.
It's balanced by the nature of the card pool more than anything else.
That was, I think, acceptable. Mental Misstep is just a completely unacceptable card. It's 1 for 1, 2 life, counter their spell. You don't spend any mana. It's more powerful than every other card on the list, including Force of Will, including Mana Drain, all those cards.
I mean, it's telling that we did top 8 Phyrexian spells a while ago, and it was number 1 there as well. And I don't know how many other slices of the pie you could take. I mean, I think it has a run at top instant. Like, there's a couple of slices you could take.
It's pretty tough to beat.
That's true, actually.
I think that I think.
But it can get misstepped.
Ancestral Recall is actually meaningfully worse in Vintage now that Mental Misstep exists. Like, it's not the on your opponent's upkeep Ancestral, with Force of Will backup is a lot more appealing when Mental Misstep is not one of the cards they can respond with. But yeah, Mental Misstep, you're never going to see a better Phyrexian mana spell ever. Like they've learned enough about Phyrexian mana that never will happen again. Like, yes, we see now 6 mana cards with 1 Phyrexian mana in their casting cost, like the completed Planeswalkers. They're not making 1 mana Phyrexian mana cards that have a meaningful effect on the game. Even Gutshot, I think, is like over
pushing it.
and Mental Misstep is just leagues better.
I mean, this whole
kilometers better for you, Dennis.
I appreciate it. This whole league. What do you mean leagues? I didn't say miles. This whole list is riddled with like R&D lessons, right? Where they're like, and some of them are good. Some of them are like, hey, maybe if you make a counterspell cost 5, but you give an alternate cost that makes it free, that's kind of an interesting, lateral move and the new way to unlock a portion of design for the game. And someday someone was like, just make 1 Phyrexian and it'll be, but it only counts 1 mana things. That's fine.
It only hits 1-drops, not every deck has tons of 1-drops. How bad could it be? And it's like, Pretty bad.
Oh, please let us know in the comments below if you disagree or if you think anything should have snuck in that didn't, or if you think maybe that Mental Misstep deserves to be dethroned. But I think that's going to be a pretty tough argument to make, to be honest. Fact or fiction this time, Luis? And this is one that I think is closer to my heart than a lot of people probably listening to this. And that is Magic the Gathering Online will be around in 5 years' time.
That's a good question. I mean, I think
I had to do some thinking on the number there in like an over-under kind of way.
Well, I think it is telling that you didn't say 2 years or 3 years, right? I assume that you think that it's pretty likely it will be around in that span of time.
Well, I think it's close. I think 3 is very likely. I think just because the amount of time taken to like take down a platform that people have assets in is not insignificant. But 5, I'm starting to be like, well, okay, let's not get ahead of ourselves here.
Okay, well, so let's just cards on the table. What side are you taking?
I don't think it will be around in 5 years' time.
Okay, so you think fiction? I think this is such a clear fact that I can't wait to debate it, because look, Magic Online is an old program. It debuted in like 2003. Thanks to the fine folks at Leaping Lizards. And
makes it a 20-year-old game now. I know it's been through plenty of updates. I remember when it was like, oh, you have to use the beta. Gross. I remember that being a discussion.
And there are some very valid criticisms leveled against it. Spreadsheet Simulator, it looked old 15 years ago. Mm-hmm. All those things are true, but I don't think Magic Online is going anywhere, and I've got a number of reasons why.
Okay.
One is there's a ton of people's value tied up in the program, right? We've got, it's not exaggerating to say many millions of worth of cards at current values, event tickets, packs, all that stuff, right? Digital objects.
I agree. And that's what I kind of said up at the top. Any kind of sunsetting plan would have to be very long and complicated and stuff. I agree.
And I think that I can't really imagine a world where Wizards makes any attempt to pay people out for that, because that just does not. They don't have to do that. My understanding is if they wanted to tomorrow, they could just flip the switch and turn Magic Online.
From a legal perspective, I think they probably could. Yeah, because
we all agreed that these these are created at their behest. We might own these things, but they're not under any obligation to keep the server going.
Yeah, right. They have no obligation to they don't acknowledge the value of them, generally speaking.
But it would still be a massive, massive headache to just do that, right? You'd have a lot of pretty angry people. There's a lot of people who have faith in Wizards that it's not going to happen. I'm one of them. I have an extensive Magic Online collection, and I have had that for quite a bit of time. And I'm confident that it's going to continue. I'm actually literally putting my money where my mouth is, right? I've got a bunch of kind of value tied up in Magic Online that I could, if I wanted, I could also
liquidate it. Yeah.
And I don't. So the first part is they don't want to deal with what happens when they sunset or turn off the program, because that's kind of like a viper's nest of potentially bad publicity, pissed off customers. There's no way to make people whole. There's no way to do anything like that. And that is feasible that I can see. So what's better, kick the can down the road. And the reason I think the road's pretty long and the can's going to keep sailing.
That's the part I'm worried about. I agree. At any given moment, you're like, oh my God, let's deal with this next year. I fully agree with that mentality, but I think how long that road is where we start to disagree.
Well, I think that the road is profitable. They want to continue going down the road. They have to pay people to work on Magic Online to code all the new cards. Not a small task like this. They have I'm sure a fairly large team.
Yeah, and the tech, like you said, it's a 20-year-old code base at the core. The tech debt is probably very significant.
And you've got there's still marketing costs, running servers, all that stuff. When something breaks, you have customer service. Running a live service game is expensive. It's not cheap.
How would you know anything about that, Lucas?
Well, the games I've been involved with are also much smaller than Magic Online, and still quite a lot of hoops to jump through to keep things going and working. A lot behind the scenes. Magic Online is a monumentally large project, but that being said, it still makes a lot of money. I would believe that Magic Online is certainly down from its peak. Arena has eaten a big slice of it.
There's no way it doesn't eat its lunch, right? It's impossible not to.
Right. And that's part of why we're even having this discussion. Mm-hmm. But Magic Online still makes a lot of money. You see how many people are in these leagues, thousands of people in all these leagues paying 10 tickets to join them. You have these premier events that cost 30 tickets, 40 tickets. And for those who don't know the Magic Online economy, a ticket's basically $1. Event tickets are pretty fixed to $1. In fact, sometimes they're worth even slightly more because it's kind of a pain to get them to based on where
it gets
you live.
choked a little at times. Yeah.
But let's call them $1. You have all these people paying entries, and Magic Online I'm confident that it makes many millions of dollars a year profit right now. Like, obviously I could be wrong, but I'm looking at how fast these things fire. And I think that unless Magic Online is managed in a way that's very different than I imagined, it is actually making quite a bit of money. So,
and I mean, the other part is, you mentioned obviously like a lot of cost is, the server costs and running and porting cards over to it. All of that, some of that cost already, like you mentioned, the R&D of the new sets, that's happening anyway, right?
Correct.
That's happened. That machine,
the actual design of the cards is free for Magic Online because it's made for Magic the Gathering in paper. So what do we have so far? It would piss a lot of people off if you stopped it,
which is the one that jumps to the front of my mind immediately, obviously.
Well, it's making you money as it continues. And there's also a third thing. How else do you play Modern online, play Pioneer online? It's Magic Online. It doesn't appear that Arena is in really any hurry to implement these older formats online. And same is true of Legacy and Vintage. Obviously, those are less of a concern than the others. But you have a lot of Magic fans, invested Magic players who want to play Pioneer, Modern, Legacy, Vintage Cube. That's a huge one. They want to play these formats online, and people playing these formats also makes Wizards money. When you have the player who has 7 Modern decks and they're invested in Modern, and they'll buy cards, they'll buy Modern Horizons, a very popular set because of Modern. Magic Online keeps them invested in Modern and keeps them invested in Magic.
I think the problem is, and I agree with everything you said so far, I think is, if not agreeable, very close to like objective fact in a lot of ways. We're obviously making some assumptions about the costs and how it runs and stuff, but I think what you've said is all true. The problem is, for me, that big companies cancel profitable things all the time because they think they can invest those same resources and that same money into other more profitable things. Yes, maybe they have a machine that every time they put $1 in, they get $2 out, but maybe this new machine seems to be making $2.50 every time. And I think there will come a time when the Arena audience and the volume of money they make from Arena, from Secret Layers, from Paper Magic continues to erode the pie of the slice that Magic Online has, small enough that eventually they're like, oh my God, screw it, put the dev team on something else, can the servers, do something else, figure out a way to make them whole that doesn't, and you'll have 6 months of horrific Reddit threads, agreed, but I think that there will come a time when that happens, and I think 5 years is about the line where I'm not sure, and part of that is because you'd have to announce the go down date like 18 months in advance or something at least.
I mean, I agree with that too. Like, I think that what you're saying also makes sense, that if Magic Online has an ROI of 100% and and they think something else has an ROI of 130%, they should pursue the one that has a higher ROI. And as Arena gets bigger, Magic Online gets smaller. Maybe, though, as Arena gets bigger, it might also filter people into these older formats.
Rising tide floats all boats kind of thing.
And so the way I would see it is, here's I kind of outlined the reasons why Magic Online is going to continue living, right? It would piss people off. It would make them very angry to shut it down. It makes money itself, and it's an outlet for people to play these older formats online, which I think is important for Wizards to have. So that's kind of what would need to happen for them to make a kind of an exit from Magic Online and fully integrate it under Arena. I don't really see an answer to piss people off. You're going to do that no matter what.
Even if they were like, hey, everything's available on Arena tomorrow, people would still be pissed.
Some amount of that is fine. It is a pretty big reputational hit to incinerate $50 million worth of Magic Online digital goods. Like, I don't know what the decision making goes into that. That seems hard to solve. The second one, Magic Online makes money. Well, it seems like it's going to continue making money for now, because until you solve the third one, the only place to play Modern is on Magic Online. People will still continue to press that button and spend 10 tickets to play Modern.
I feel like the costs don't go down over time, though, right? They may even go up.
My guess is they don't go down over time.
And I feel like if we think about it, it is eating its pie, and maybe not even eating its pie, but maybe Arena and Paper are growing at even just a faster rate.
Yeah,
that eventually that equation starts to tip.
I think that is definitely possible, and I'm not betting that Magic Online will be here in 15 years. I think 5 years is still too short of a timeline for them to figure out a way to offer these older formats on Arena and a transition from Magic Online to Arena, and Magic Online is not making enough money so that it justifies making all those other decisions.
I don't think transferring to Arena is the way yet. I think they would just eventually grow it enough and have maybe they get Pioneer on there and that's it, right? And then they're like, all right.
I just don't see a world where Wizards doesn't offer a digital way to play Modern. I don't think it makes sense for them. Like, why would you alienate that many players? Modern's a very popular format.
Yeah, I mean, in my head, Standard and Commander and Limited just grow enough.
Modern's way more popular than Standard.
Yeah, it's true.
Like, people don't play Standard.
I know. I used to run events. They're different. There's no
which is a different problem for a different episode, because that is also kind of a thing to untangle. But
yeah, that's true.
Actually, Magic Online.
X format is the truest way to play the game. Is definitely a fact of fiction of itself. There's no debate
there. And you know what? I'm again putting my money where my mouth is. I got a bunch of cards on Magic Online, and I have no plans on getting rid of them. So, Dennis, if you want, you can sell me all your Magic Online cards.
You can. I mean, there's not a lot in there, but you can have them, buddy. I am the doomsday prepper in this scenario. I am turtling down. Enough. I'm being like, Marvel Snap's pretty fun. Let's go. Like,
Marvel Snap is fun. All right, remind me 5 years. We'll see.
Remind me 5 years. And dude, I get it. I love Magic Online. That was how I first started playing the game. I remember, like, I still say F6. That's a Magic Online term. It doesn't mean anything anymore. And I would be sad to see it go. And I think it would be a mistake, but I think it is one that they are very likely to make in the next 5 years. Hit or myth for Phyrexia All Be One. This one's pulling on the old nostalgia heartstrings a little more than the average set, I think.
Yeah, I mean, Phyrexia is one of the oldest running villains for Magic. Like, I think the first mention of Phyrexia was in Antiquities.
Let's go back.
Gate to Phyrexia, stuff like that. But even Urza Saga was really where I remember seeing a lot of that sort of stuff, Phyrexia Negators and whatnot. But seeing this, the Mirrodin world as well, there's a lot of really cool stuff going on.
A lot of callbacks. And, I get excited anytime I hear a card start with Sword of. So I'm like, let's go. I'm here for that. First up, we got, the name of the set. It's going to be sad if this one doesn't crack the myth, the sort of difficult to reach myth tier. We got All Will Be One.
Oh, this is a clear hit. When you have All Will Be One on the battlefield, the game completely changes. Mm-hmm. What your cards do is completely transformed. Now you want to put counters on things for All Will Be One's sake. You don't even care about what's happening, though. Of course, you're getting the value from that too. You can proliferate onto your opponent's stuff. It counts as you putting a counter on things, and you can give yourself poison counters if you're not in danger of dying from it, just to get extra pings. It is a really cool card. When you play a Planeswalker, it gets it deals damage equal to the amount of counters.
Because the loyalty comes on all at once. Yeah.
And then you can +2 you play a Koth, hit for 4, +2 it, another 2, like easy hit.
You're right. It just completely transforms the game. And there's no denying the impact of the card, right? Like there's
such a cool card.
And it does have this sort of like horrifying togetherness about it that feels very, very mythic. And it does feel like they pulled out all the stops. When you name a card after the set, it's kind of got to be a banger, right?
Yeah, and they succeeded here.
Next up, we have Atraxa. One of the most just the term Atraxa to me is like one of the most upsetting commander cards ever. So the Phyrexianized version is one I'm possibly even more scared of.
Yeah, and Atraxa has been showing up all over the place. 7/7 flying, lifelink, vigilance.
Yeah, the
touch.
Keyword soup right up top.
And also, you look at your top 10 cards and you draw probably like 3 to 5 card types from it, depending on how your deck is constructed. Also, it only costs 7 total mana. It's across 4 different colors, but 7 mana is really not that much on the grand scheme of things. I was actually playing Modern Indomitable Creativity, and I just hardcast off 6 lands and a treasure token, and it was good enough to win the game. Atraxa is definitely a hit. Just a cool card, does a bunch of cool stuff, has the kind of game altering effect that you look for in one of these flagship cards. And I think
absolute must answer, like you said, probably draws you 3 or 4 cards right off the bat. Yeah. It is a little cheating from a design perspective, I think, to be like, flying and vigilance. Like, it doesn't need vigilance, right? That's unnecessary.
Well, it's one ability per color.
I get it.
And its casting cost.
Hang on, it gets blue gives it flying, white gives it vigilance, green gives it lifelink. That doesn't seem right.
No, green gives it vigilance. Green can get vigilance.
I know green can. I don't like that. I mean, I remember
and black is giving it first strike, which is also
that's exactly what I was thinking of immediately. But it's a hit for me too. Like it is too too impactful a card not to be. Even if the 1-to-1 mapping is something I take a little bit of issue with. How do you feel about Awe? It wouldn't be a Magic the Gathering set without a big old dragon. How do you feel about Capricious Hellraiser?
I actually think this one's a myth for me.
These are rarely hits generally, I think, to be honest.
Yeah, it's just a little bit too fiddly, where it's like it exiles 3 cards at random. You can play a non-creature, non-land spell from them, from your graveyard. But like if you miss on, like if you hit a bunch of creatures and lands, you don't get to play anything. It also only gets cheaper when you have tons of cards in your graveyard, which is pretty hard to get to. I don't know. I'm not super into it. I think that I would have liked to see it a little easier to cast for 3 mana to make it a little more exciting. I think as is, Capricious Hellraiser is a myth.
I agree. It feels like one of those cards that's been through the ringer in balancing and R&D, where I think maybe that first ability might have come from a different card at some point. And they're like, oh, I'll put this in here and take all these numbers up and down. And you're right. It feels very fiddly and finicky. And like from a flavor perspective, I don't really get why this dragon gets cheaper if a bunch of things are dead, and then why that lets me do something for free. It doesn't, it's a myth for me too, 100%. Moving on from a big old dragon to a big old intangible otherworldly horror. How do we feel about Drivnod Carnage Dominus?
So these are a cycle, and I think that they're okay. They all share the capability of getting an indestructible counter on them. And Drivnod has a cool effect, right? Whenever one of your creatures dying triggers something, you trigger it twice instead. So I like that. They did cost it pretty conservatively at 5 mana for an 8/3, but I think it does a cool thing. And it's not, when I think of Mythic, it's not just about power level. And in this particular case, I think like All Will Be One, for example, is not the most powerful card in the world.
Right, but it's game warping, and that 3 toughness doesn't matter too much if you're indestructible, right?
Yeah. And I think Drivnod is it's also one of, I think the only one that you can make indestructible for 0 mana paid. Like it's only Phyrexian mana. So I would say Drivnod's a hit. It's a little weird. It's a little hard to use, but I think it's cool. It makes sense for Mythic. Doubling your death triggers is a Mythic feeling thing.
I agree. And it gets a bump for me for Carnage Dominus sounding like a speed metal band, to be honest. Yeah. Like that takes it over for me, if nothing else. Now this one has a lot, even just the name of this gives me chills. It's got a lot to live up to. And that is Elish Norn, Mother of Machines.
Oh yeah, this one's also a hit for me. Stopping your opponent's ETBs, doubling your ETBs is huge, and it's also just a really big statted creature for just 5 mana.
Just a bunch of numbers, right?
Like, so I think Elish Norn lives up to her reputation, and Elish Norn, Mother of Machines is a clear hit for me. Really cool card.
And it harkens back to old Elish Norn, with the like mirrored effect. Good for me, bad for you. It feels very similar. Again, much like other cards, Vigilance kind of weird. Very nice on a 4/7. Don't knock that at all. But it feels. I don't think it stands up to old school Elish Norn though.
I think they're just different cards. I mean, the mirroring I think is pulled off well here. As to which is more powerful, the old one's probably more powerful, but who to win in a fight? Also the old one. But I think this Elish Norn's a hit.
All right, moving on to Ickermoon Gauntlet. One of them, their nonsense, and also as this one of the nonsense Mythic artifacts. Also, just some like text formatting I've never seen on a Magic card before.
The loyalty symbols and everything. Yeah. This is it lets you put a counter on anything whenever you play a non-creature spell, and your planeswalkers all have +1 proliferate and -12.
0 proliferate.
0 proliferate, -12 take an extra turn.
This feels like a myth to me.
This is one of those like exceedingly complicated, fancy things that doesn't really do anything. And I think that there's too many steps here to try to envision even like what are you trying to accomplish that, I'm not in for Ickermoon Gauntlet. Myth for me.
When we talked about top 8 counterspells, we kind of marveled at the beauty and the cleanness and the brevity of counter target spell. And this is the exact opposite end of that spectrum.
It does say counter on it though.
That's true. That's true. The wrong kind, unfortunately. From a flavor perspective, this next card and the art is is perfect for me. And that is Jace the Perfected Mind. So I love the Mind Sculptor pose with the Phyrexian text in the middle. That's sick. That would honestly might bump it up to hit for me, regardless of any of the text on the card.
Well, I think the card actually plays pretty well too. This is a hit for me. This is a planeswalker that plays more like a fireball than most planeswalkers, where you can always use the ultimate and you're just nugging them for 3 cards for every loyalty it's got. And I think that the Jace plays in a really sweet way. The completed part's cool too. It makes sense for a flavor perspective, and getting to sneak it in at 3 mana sometimes is nice. So yeah, I think Jace is a hit.
And it's one of those things that if you got this slammed against you in the pre-release, it is so brutal in a 40 card
fantastic card
format
for sure.
All right, moving on to Luca Bound to Ruin, another completed planeswalker here. How do we feel about this?
I like Luca. I would say I'm a kind of like Luca warm on him, as it were.
Nice, strong.
That's a hit. That's a hit right there.
That's a hit for sure.
Luca doesn't do anything we haven't really seen before.
It feels like an old Garrick card.
Add some mana. Right? Yeah, the -4 is like a fireball equal to your highest, stat creature. It's all fine. I guess this is a myth overall, just because as a mythic rare, I would kind of hope to see a little bit more new stuff. So it's borderline for me, but I guess I'd give it a myth.
Yeah, it doesn't feel very Phyrexian to me. Like, I know the beasts have Toxic 1. Also, I am irrationally upset by seeing 2 red hybrid Phyrexia and green. If you're a new player and you open this card, you're like, what are you talking about?
It's a lot.
It's rare to see complexity creep in the converted mana cost of a card. But that's definitely something that scratches that itch for me here with Luca. And yeah, I agree. I think it's a myth for me too, but it is close. I think a little bit more of an interesting ultimate maybe would have bumped it over the line for me. How do we feel about all right, moving on to the white card of the cycle, Mondrak Glory Dominus, the Christian rock band equivalent, I guess.
Yeah. It doubles your token making. And I think this is fine. It pales a little thanks to the Elish Norn comparison. They're both mythics. They're both white. They both do a doubling thing. And I think Elish Norn is a lot cooler. So I would, I guess, slightly give Mondrak a myth because of that, even though I think it's a solid card.
Yeah, I mean, it's like from like a vanilla test perspective, it's rock solid. And if you have any tokens that get generated anyway, where it starts to get pretty huge, it's probably one of the less appealing ones to make indestructible, I would say. I think they probably could have gotten away with, considering you're sacrificing offensive creatures, with reducing that cost a little bit.
For activate ability. I think so.
Yeah, this one might be a myth for me. I think this one's just a little bit under the line, and maybe that's just on a power level. And you're right. Once you compare it to Elish Norn, it kind of gets
maybe it's unfair because of the Elish Norn comparison. It wouldn't be in most sets, but here we are. And
I mean, what are you gonna do?
Cards side by side, right? So
that's the game we're playing. Back to Completed Beloved, and the art on this is absolutely brutal. We have Nahiri the Unforgiving.
So this one's a myth for me because of how weird it is. Like, again, this isn't really power level. Like, I think Nahiri has applications in some decks, I'm sure. But the way it plays out, where it's like you can force someone to attack, but they can't attack Nahiri. You can exile things from your graveyard, making temporary copies of them using I don't know. I just look at this card and like I don't really grasp intuitively how it works and plays out. And it's not a card that's very pleasurable for me to try to figure out. I don't know. Something about the card is just the vibes aren't there. I'm going to give Nahiri a myth.
I agree. And what I think it is for me is sometimes you look at a card and you're like, oh, I see what they're trying to do here. And maybe they didn't hit it for you. Maybe it's, maybe they misstepped, or maybe they had to balance it down for some reason. But I don't even really see what they were trying to do here. Like, if you'd given this any other name than Nahiri, I would have been like, oh, okay, sure. It doesn't feel Nahiri to me. It doesn't feel like, even particularly like red-white to me. It's just kind of a mess of a bunch of abilities. And I think it is the redheaded stepchild of all the sort of completed planeswalkers in the set, to be honest. Moving on though, Nissa Ascended Animist. This one's, I think, might be a hit for me.
Yeah, I like Nissa. This is the double Phyrexian 7 mana Nissa that has like a disenchant, make a big elemental, do a big overrun. I like that you can overrun immediately if you pay the full cost for it.
Yep.
I like that it's got a cool combination of abilities and how it works out. And I think this feels like a little more Phyrexianized of a Nissa with a little bit more aggressive of a destroy ability, which Nissa typically doesn't have, right? Nissa makes makes creatures, and this kind of feels different. So Nissa's a hit for me. I think Nissa plays out and is cool enough, in a way that makes it a hit.
I agree. The only notes that I would have are, I think that the +1 and the ultimate are both just kind of normal green abilities, right?
Yeah.
Like, ordinarily that +1 probably
yeah,
they could have been dialed up a little bit. Ordinarily, I guess that +1 probably would be just like the number of forests you control or the number of creatures you control or something.
Sure.
Rather than her own loyalty, which I guess actually, to be fair, that's a little more selfish, right? Which is not really her vibe. So but I feel like I'm reaching a little bit there. I don't know, maybe giving them Toxic 1 or something, maybe something like that. But then you get into a whole balance headache. But yeah, I agree. Hit overall for sure. Sometimes it's okay to play the hits, right? And Phyrexian Obliterator definitely scratches that itch for me.
Yeah, I think Phyrexian Obliterator is a clear hit. Like it's a fan
100%.
favorite. It feels quad black like any other card. It's an alien, basically, right? From
And
Aliens.
even the pose, even in this one, just looks like
Yeah, so pretty easy hit. Was a hit last time. Will always be a hit.
will always be hit. And it's so good when you play it against someone who hasn't played it before, because they
Oh
turn
yeah.
around and they're like, hang on, wait, what? Oh my God, what? It's
Yep.
so brutal. Yeah, definitely hit for me. Foil to the opposite side of Phyrexian Liberator. How do we feel about Phyrexian Vindicator?
I'm into this also, like giving it flying instead of trample, giving it damage reflecting ability instead of a permanent sacrificing ability. Feels very obliterator like, but in a different color.
Mm-hmm.
And I like the quad white symbol. This is cool. This is a really cool card. This
It's
this card more than most really communicates that every color here is doing evil Phyrexian stuff, even if it's like traditionally white's like one of the good colors, right?
I think there was a time in designing this set where they had this card in, and they're like, "Oh, it's a callback to Phyrexian Obliterator, right? It's cool." And then somebody was like, "Could just put Obliterator in too, though, right? Like we don't need to. We can have both, right? That's no problem." I think that's how we got here for sure. All right, back to our Dominus cycle. We have the red one, Solfin Mayhem Dominus.
I actually like this one a lot less because red, it doubles all your non-combat damage, and red just that's just not that exciting of a keyword, or
Doubling
an
burn
ability
spells,
rather.
basically, right?
Yeah, so I and discarding cards to make it indestructible also feels like, yeah, it's red, but
It's one of the
I
more
don't.
attainable ones as well, to be
It
honest.
is. It only costs 1 mana plus the 2 Phyrexian, and then you could just do it right away. But I don't know. I think this is a myth. It just doesn't feel as mythic as I would like.
Yeah, I think there might have been a draft of this where it doubled all damage.
Yeah,
It doubled all
that would
damage.
be mythic.
Yeah, right. But it might have doubled all damage taken and given, maybe. That kind of bargain feels a little bit Phyrexian as well. And then it's kind of cute that it's that it can get indestructible, so it doesn't care, right? That might have been a version of it. But yeah, I think it's a myth as it sits too. Staff of Completion. So this is a well we've returned to a lot over Magic's history in Stick
Yeah,
What Does stuff.
I'm not a fan of this one. I don't know what went on with this, that every ability costs so much life. You're just paying so much life to use this card that it just doesn't seem like a plausible card to put in almost any deck. Like, I don't understand. I think you could make it like one less life on each ability and it would still not even necessarily be that good. So I'm
Yeah.
in this particular case, the mechanic, as cool as like some of the concepting is, the actual playing the mechanic is too costly to really make me imagine wanting to put this card in my deck.
That just has to be a balance consideration, right? I'm sure there was a draft, and I know I'm talking a lot about the drafts of the cards in the
Yeah.
design, but I'm sure there was a draft in the card files that was sick. And then someone had to be like, okay, slow down.
I mean, maybe, but I think they're rightfully afraid of Phyrexian mana. This is basically paying Phyrexian mana.
Yeah,
And I think they might have just started pretty high on this card. Who knows?
it's possible. Yeah, I think it's a myth for me too. Here we go. Now we're talking Sword of Forge and Frontier. I love a good
Oh,
sword. And how do you feel about this one? Does this cross the line for you?
yeah, this one's great. I mean, the exile the top 2 cards, play an additional land this turn, feels very red and green in a way that's very synergistic. Pro red and pro green is also really strong in this set particular. And this fills out the sword cycle nicely. So I like the Sword of Forge and Frontier a lot. This is a hit.
It's a sick name as well, just Forge and
Yeah.
Frontiers. The art I don't love, I'll be honest. I don't like that sort of
Okay.
Hexa sort of future swordy looking thing. It looks like a sword from Halo or something. I don't love that
Yeah.
vibe. But you're right. The effect feels very red and green. This is a hit for me. I think they would have had to screw this one up pretty badly for it not to be for me. And luckily they stuck the landing. One of the wildest card arts I've seen in a long time. We have Tekuthal Inquiry Dominus. So the blue one of the cycle. With the double proliferate passive.
I do like double proliferating. I think that is kind of cool. This one actually feels like it's going in a different direction, like,
Mhm.
and it pushes you to use cards in kind of a weird way. So I like Tekuthal. This is the Dominuses are all kind of borderline. Most of them have been misses so far, but I would give Tekuthal a hit.
I think it's a hit too, and mostly because this is the first one we've seen, I think, that has a meaningful synergy between the two abilities, right?
Yeah.
It lets you proliferate more, which gives you the bonus tokens to be able to make it indestructible.
The white one also does too. It lets you double your token making, then sacrifice them. But I agree. This one it does have a good synergy, and I like it.
This is a very clean through line. Yeah, I think this one's a hit for sure. Wouldn't be a Magic set again without a big old dinosaur. How do we feel about Tyrannix Rex? Aside from, I hate the name, I think it's dumb. It could have gone either way. and it went myth for me on the name at least.
Yeah, this one's close for me, but I also agree it's a myth. It doesn't feel that exciting. And I don't know, the big dinosaur dudes are just,
it's
just
very
whatever.
rare that they're cool, right? It's really hard to do.
I agree with that.
And I don't care how many words you throw on there, trample, ward 4, haste, and toxic 4. I'm not buying it. We're coming up to the end here, only 2 more to go. How do you feel about Vraska Betrayal's Sting?
This one's a myth for me because it feels too much like the other Vraska, where it's just a different way of turning something into a treasure. The other one destroys something and gives them a treasure. This just turns it into a treasure, which I think is probably a cleaner implementation in some ways.
It's cooler for sure, yeah.
Yeah, it's also pack you up in a little treasure box, but but it's not different enough. Whereas you know how like the Nissa felt different, the Jace felt different. This did not feel different, and same with Luca, right? Luca felt too much like Garrick. This Vraska feels too much like Vraska,
and it's hard for them, right? Because Vraska in a vacuum doesn't feel un-Phyrexian already.
It's true.
She's kind of evil and all about rotting and turns things to stone. So like it's not a million miles off. It was joining the Phyrexian Legion was not as big a leap for Vraska as it was for some of the other walkers, I think.
Yeah, I do agree with that, and maybe that's a challenge. But at the end of the day, this Vraska doesn't feel meaningfully different from the other ones, and as a completed Planeswalker, I would have wanted to feel that. So
I agree.
Vraska is a myth for me.
It's a myth for me too. And then the last one, the green one, Hunger Dominus, is Zopandrel, which sounds a little bit like a drug. It sounds like something from Ask Your Doctor about Zopandrel.
Yeah. You know, if your liver function, you know, needs Zopandrel to really fully do this.
Take twice a day with a meal. And in this case, I guess it's a steroid because it bumps you up. No joke.
It doubles all your stats every turn. You know, on their turn and your turn. I think this is a myth. It's just not cool enough. It's also just so many stats. Well, past a certain point, like how cool is it to get more stats when you're already getting so many stats?
Yeah, everything becomes the Abyss eventually, right? It doesn't matter.
Shout out to the misprint. The Phyrexian version of this card is misprinted, where it costs 1 more to activate its ability than the actual version.
Oh, that's pretty brutal. That's unfortunate. Oh yeah, there we go. The Blackie foil one. Yeah. That's pretty brutal. Yeah, that's a really bad misprint.
I guess overall the Dominus cycle really didn't do it for us, huh?
No, they didn't hit. I love that. I do love this ability up top. I kind of like doubling.
We like the blue and the black ones. Those ones were cool.
And this one's more borderline for me, but yeah, the red and the white ones are a myth.
Yeah, it's a myth. But overall, I think the set did pretty well. It hit on half the completed Planeswalkers, like 2 of the 5 Dominus, and then things like Elish Norn, the Sword. Like there are some all will be one.
Yeah, the Vindicator and the Obliterator.
And the Obliterator, yeah, totally. I think overall the set was pretty good for Mythics.
And I think they set out overall. Yeah, they set out to do a pretty hard thing where they're taking characters we know and love, or at least know, maybe we don't love all of them, no, familiar with, and trying to put a very heavy, like, you know, carrying a lot of baggage with it in terms of Magic's history twist on it. That's hard to land all the time. And yes, they could have landed it a couple more times, but I'm a sucker for a Phyrexian Obliterator. I'm a sucker for a Sword cycle. So yeah, I think it's over the line for me too.